In the 1300s, a disease arrived that killed millions and changed Europe forever. But the Black Death did more than take lives. It changed work, money, religion, cities, and the world itself. Alright, before we talk about the Black Death itself, we need to understand the world it entered. Because Europe in the 1300s was already going through a lot. This was not a peaceful, perfect world where people were simply living their normal lives and then, out of nowhere, a terrible disease appeared. No. Europe was already crowded, poor in many places, politically divided, and connected by growing trade routes. And that last part is really important. Because the same roads and ships that carried food, cloth, spices, silver, and other goods across huge distances could also carry something nobody could see. Disease. To understand how the Black Death became such a huge disaster, we have to go back to the beginning of the 14th century. At this time, most people in Europe lived in small villages. Their lives were built around farming. You planted crops. You raised animals. You hoped the weather stayed good. And you prayed that nothing destroyed your harvest. For most ordinary people, life was not easy. There were no modern hospitals. There were no antibiotics. There were no modern ideas about bacteria. People did not know what caused infections. They could see that sickness spread from one person to another, but they did not understand why. And even before the Black Death arrived, Europe had already experienced serious problems with food. The population had grown for hundreds of years. More people meant more farmland was needed. Forests were cleared. New fields were created. Villages became larger. Cities grew. Trade became more active. At first, this growth looked like a good thing. More people meant more work. More workers meant more food and more goods. More trade meant more money moving through cities. But there was a problem. The system was becoming stretched. Europe was depending heavily on farming, and farming depended heavily on weather. Then came a series of terrible harvests in the early 1300s. The period from 1315 onward became especially difficult in many parts of Europe. Heavy rain damaged crops. Fields became wet. Food became harder to produce. Animals died. People went hungry. This period is often called the Great Famine. And honestly, this matters a lot when we talk about the Black Death. Because millions of people were already living close to the edge. If a family had a bad harvest, they might survive. But if several bad harvests came one after another, things became much worse. Food prices rose. Poor families had less to eat. Weak people became even weaker. And when people are already struggling with hunger and poor living conditions, disease can hit much harder. That is exactly the kind of world the Black Death would later enter. Now, let's look at the cities. Medieval cities were nothing like modern cities. Imagine walking into a major European city in the 1300s. You would see busy streets. Markets. Shops. Merchants. Animals. Workers. Travelers. Religious buildings. And huge numbers of people living very close together. But there was a major problem. Clean water and waste management were nowhere near what we expect today. People could throw waste into streets. Animals could move through crowded areas. Food could become contaminated. And many homes were small and packed together. There was no modern sewage system. There was no understanding of germs. There was no idea that tiny organisms could spread disease. So cities could become perfect places for infections to move from person to person. But Europe was not isolated. And this is where the story gets even bigger. By the 1300s, Europe was part of a much larger trading world. Merchants were traveling across Europe and far beyond it. Goods moved through the Mediterranean. Ships traveled between ports. Caravans crossed long distances through Asia. Major trade routes connected different regions. One of the most important areas in this story was the Black Sea. The Black Sea connected Europe with parts of Asia and the wider trading networks of the time. Cities around the Black Sea became important centers of trade. Merchants from different cultures met there. Goods moved through ports. Ships carried cargo from one region to another. And with all this movement came something else. Rats and fleas. The disease that caused the Black Death was linked to a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The bacteria could live in certain animals, especially rodents. Fleas feeding on infected animals could then spread the bacteria. And when infected fleas moved to new hosts, the disease could travel with them. That sounds simple now. But people in the 1300s had no idea this was happening. They did not know about bacteria. They did not understand the role of fleas. They could not look inside a microscope and see what was going on. They simply saw healthy people becoming sick. And then dying. That made the disease terrifying. But before the Black Death reached Europe, there was another important part of the story. The Mongol world. During the 1200s and 1300s, the Mongol Empire had created one of the largest connected political spaces in history. At its height, Mongol rule stretched across huge parts of Asia and into Eastern Europe. This created something historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. The phrase does not mean everything was peaceful. There were still wars and conflicts. But Mongol control over huge territories made long-distance travel and trade easier in many areas. Merchants could move farther. Caravans traveled across Central Asia. Ideas moved. Technologies moved. People moved. And diseases could move too. This growing connection between distant parts of Eurasia is one of the most important pieces of the Black Death story. Because the plague did not simply appear in Europe by magic. It traveled through a world that was becoming more connected. And that is a major lesson from this entire story. Connection can bring wealth. It can bring new ideas. It can bring technology. But it can also bring danger. The same trade networks that helped cities become rich could also help a disease cross thousands of miles. Now, there is still a lot we do not know about the exact starting point of the Black Death. For a long time, historians debated where the pandemic began. Modern research points toward Central Asia as an important part of the plague's history, with evidence connecting the disease to regions around the Tian Shan area. From there, the disease could move along trade networks. It did not need an army. It did not need a king. It did not need a government. All it needed was movement. An infected animal. A flea. A ship. A caravan. A traveler. And a place where people were living close together. That was enough. By the 1340s, the disease had reached areas around the Black Sea. One location became especially famous in the story of the Black Death. The city of Caffa, a major trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. Caffa was controlled by Genoese merchants. The city was involved in trade between Europe and the wider regions around the Black Sea. And in the 1340s, Caffa became caught in a conflict involving the Mongol Golden Horde. The Mongol forces besieged the city. According to a famous account written by the notary Gabriel de Vimusi, plague victims were thrown into the city during the siege. This story has become one of the most famous episodes connected to the spread of the Black Death. But historians debate exactly how much this event contributed to the wider spread of the disease. So we should be careful. The idea that the plague was deliberately launched into Caffa like an early biological weapon is famous, but the evidence is not strong enough to treat every detail of the story as certain. What we do know is that Caffa was connected to major trade routes. And ships leaving the Black Sea could carry people, goods, rodents, and fleas toward Mediterranean ports. That connection mattered. From the Black Sea, the disease could move west. And once it reached major ports, it had access to one of the most connected parts of medieval Europe. The Mediterranean. Think about what that meant. A ship could leave one port. It could travel to another. People could get on and off. Goods could be loaded. Animals could move. And if infected fleas or rodents were traveling with the cargo, the disease could appear in a completely new place. The people receiving those ships had no idea what was coming. They did not know the danger was already inside their city. They could not see it. They could not smell it. They could not stop it at the border. And they had no modern medical tools to fight it. This is why the Black Death spread so quickly. It entered a world that was already deeply connected but had almost no understanding of infectious disease. And now we need to talk about something else. Religion. For medieval Europeans, religion was a huge part of everyday life. The church was not just something people visited on Sundays. Religion shaped how people understood life. It shaped ideas about death. It shaped laws, traditions, festivals, education, and even how people explained disasters. So when a disease started killing people at an unbelievable speed, people naturally tried to understand it through the beliefs they already had. Was it God's punishment? Was it a sign? Was the end of the world coming? People wanted answers. But nobody had the scientific knowledge to give them. And as the death toll grew, fear became stronger. Still, the Black Death had not yet reached its worst point in Europe. The real disaster was about to begin. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was about to face one of the most deadly pandemics in human history. And the people living there had no idea how completely their world was about to change. The first signs could appear almost ordinary. Someone might develop a fever. Then weakness. Then painful swelling. Then confusion. Then serious illness. And in many cases, death could come very quickly. People watched their family members become sick. Then their neighbors. Then entire communities. Doctors could not explain it. Priests could not stop it. Kings could not stop it. Rich people could not simply buy their way out of it. And poor people had even fewer choices. This was what made the Black Death different from many earlier disasters. A war might destroy one town. A famine might destroy a harvest. But the plague could enter almost every part of society. It did not care whether someone was rich or poor. It did not care whether someone lived in a village or a city. It did not care about borders. And it did not care about power. That is why the story of the Black Death is not just a story about disease. It is a story about an entire society being pushed to its limit. And once millions of people started dying, the old system could not simply continue as before. There would be fewer workers. Less farmland would be needed. Wages could change. Landowners would lose labor. Trade would be disrupted. Families would disappear. Villages would be abandoned. Religious beliefs would be tested. Governments would struggle. And ordinary people would begin asking questions they had never asked before. If so many people could die so suddenly, then what was really holding society together? That question would help change Europe. But first, the disease had to arrive. And it was already on its way. The ships were moving. The trade routes were open. The ports were busy. And the people of Europe were completely unaware that one of the greatest disasters in their history was approaching. The Black Death was no longer just somewhere far away. It was coming straight toward them. The Black Death did not simply end when the disease disappeared. Europe had changed. Millions of people were gone. Villages had been abandoned. Families had been broken apart. Trade had been disrupted. And the old way of life could no longer continue exactly as it had before. But something unexpected happened. With fewer workers, surviving laborers became more valuable. In many places, wages increased. Landowners had to compete for workers. Ordinary people slowly gained more bargaining power. The plague also changed how people thought about death, religion, medicine, and perhaps the biggest lesson is this. The Black Death showed just how connected the medieval world already was. A disease could travel across thousands of miles through the same trade routes that carried silk, spices, silver, food, and ideas. It changed Europe forever. And centuries later, we can still see its effects in the way societies think about disease, cities, trade, work, and even death. So the Black Death was not just one terrible event in medieval history. It was a turning point. A moment when the old world was